Good evening. My name is Carol Wilhelm, and the Powell-Liberty Historical Society welcomes you to our Monday, November 9th program, which is being recorded on November the 3rd. I'm delighted to introduce Gretchen Curtis, a Powell resident and one who enjoys spending considerable time in Lakeside, Ohio. You may recall that Gretchen offered a program several years ago on the history of the Chautauqua movement. Gretchen has held a variety of leadership roles at Ohio's Chautauqua Institution on Lake Erie. Probably 10 years ago, she invited our Sherry Carmichael to present her Victorian Valentine program to the Women's Club at Lakeside. I joined Sherry for the trip, and I was smitten with the place. Returning to Lakeside for several days each summer has brought me real joy. Gretchen had a 36-year career in pediatric nursing, most of those years at Denver Children's Hospital, till moving to Powell 16 years ago. I know she is a knitter, so I invite you to hear her describe her interest in researching a war effort many of us are unfamiliar with: Homefront knitting during World War I and World War II. The Powell-Liberty Historical Society endeavors to offer programs honoring Veterans Day each year, and we hope you will enjoy this one. Thank you to Linda and Alan Miller for making this possible. Gretchen?
I am pleased to be here at the Martin Perry House today, November the 3rd, Election Day across these United States. By the time you're watching this, we may know who is president, possible we will not, but talking about the troops today who fought during World War I and World War II reminds us of all of the veterans of this country who put their lives at risk, that we may have freedoms in this country, including the right to vote. I start because with this photo of this elderly woman knitting, because it's what a lot of people think when they think of knitters. They're little old ladies, and in fact, a lot of little old ladies knit, but here in this room today, we have 4 women, all of whom are knitters, and none of us look quite as old as this individual. Let me tell you how I became interested in this topic. I've been a knitter since probably I was about 16, not doing anything dramatic in terms of my output, but as part of the Lakeside Women's Club Service Project for the past 16 years now, we have participated in the national program called Warm Up America. In this program, individuals knit squares that are 7" by 9". They're crocheted together and given to either a local agency. We at the Women's Club provide our blankets to the Ottawa County Salvation Army. And last year was the 15th anniversary of our participation in that program. So as one of the almost yearly speakers at the Women's Club, I wanted to honor that project, looking at how knitting has been used across decades in this country and internationally to benefit not only the individual knitter, but her community. Knitting goes back centuries, and it certainly was an important part of Civil War efforts. But today we're going to focus on World War I and World War II. But this is a circa 1885 knitting and crocheting manual. Ginny June is, you can barely see it up here, it says Ginny June series, and then down here at the bottom also edited by Ginny June, but that was a pen name for a female columnist of the Victorian era. So nothing new relative to the knitting manuals we currently use. a la Martha Stewart. Jenny June was popular in her day. Other knitters at the turn of the century, 1890 into 1900, Queen Victoria, and this is a tintype probably representing a woman during the Civil War period and her knitting. We're going to start. The majority of the program and the slides represent the Great War. This particular knitting book was by Lady Annette Liverpool, who was the wife of New Zealand's governor, and it was first published in 1915 and then reprinted in 1917. And she made it a small size that would fit into a knitting bag, so it could be carried with the woman wherever she went. And she penned the poem that appears on the cover of the knitting book, stating, "For the empire and for freedom, we all must do our bit. The men go forth to battle, the women wait and knit." And on the cover, you see the woman looking out on the soldiers through her window, holding her knitting in her lap. There were a wide variety of patterns that were printed for use by women, men, and children during the Great War period of time. One of the things I enjoyed looking at as I researched this program were the illustrations on the cover of these knitting instruction manuals, as well as the sheet music, which we will get to later in the program. But this refers to the knitted comforts for men and women, men on land and sea. And one of the things I found interesting is that that's what all the knitted items were referred to, were as comforts. Not specifically, you know, I'm knitting a hat, I'm knitting a vest, I'm knitting mittens for a specific person, my husband, my fiance, my brother, but they were called comforts. People really latched on to that idea that what I am doing will bring comfort to men I know and care for, as well as anonymous men that I'm just knitting for because that's important in my contribution to the Great War. You see on the cover of this, there is an army soldier, a sailor, and a merchant marine. And in the background, behind the men, are these illustrations of ships out on the sea. Here's another one that I think is beautifully illustrated, simply called War Knitting. On the front cover, it's folded. On the front cover is this split screen of ships in battle on the right side of the heart. The left side shows cannons and the sailor's rope and anchor that hold the heart in place for the boys of the U.S. Army and Navy. But on the back side, it refers to women's weapons. They're underneath the illustration of the woman and shows a hank of yarn that has been used to outline her portrait and the knitting needles. Those were the women's weapons used to help fight the war. New Zealand Spinster Club knitting socks for World War I soldiers, with Britain being the leader of this enormous empire around the world. All of the empire participated in providing comforts that could be used by the troops in Europe. So there were clubs in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, all providing for the comforts for Britain's soldiers. The demands for socks was unending. When Britain entered the war in September of 1914, they had to supply over 253 voluntary enlistees with a full uniform. By September of 1918, 4 years later, over 5 million Britons had been in uniform. Now, the standard allocation for socks was 3 pair every 6 months during the time the soldier was serving. That equated to over 137 million pairs of socks during that 4 years period of time that had to be provided. Now, there were ready-made socks, of course, being manufactured, but they were not of the same high quality that hand-knitted socks are. And those of you who've worn hand-knitted socks know how long they last and how much more comfortable they are. Endless marches throughout Europe, the flooded trenches that were a constant during this era of trench warfare, and the frigid, damp weather of the battlefields, particularly in France, Belgium, caused trench feet, a fungal disease that had a deadly effect, could in fact lead to death for a number of soldiers. As a fungal disease, it didn't have a treatment, and the men's best protection was to wear 2 pair of handmade socks. Now, if you only had 3 pair of socks to begin with, and they were damp and cold, and it was wintertime, it was hard to keep your socks clean and dry. So socks were the #1 item that brought comfort to the troops and protected their feet. One of the patterns, at the bottom of the pattern, it had a little paragraph. I've retyped it here because the type was so small, even if I'd enlarged it, you would not have been able to read it. But it was called Don'ts for Knitters of Socks. And here were the don'ts. Don't cast on too tightly. An otherwise well-knitted sock may become useless if the top edge is too tight. Don't knot your wool. Join it by splicing the ends or leave 2 to 3 inches to darn back carefully. Don't forget that a man may not have a chance to change socks for many days, and a knot or lump brings a blister. If the blister breaks, blood poisoning may result in the loss of a foot or even a life. We cannot afford to lose our men through negligence or ignorance. Don't use needles too fine for the wool. The knitting should be elastic. If knitted too tightly, the sock becomes hard. And finally, don't make a foot less than 11 inches long. If you're using a size smaller needle, add 8 stitches to the directions provided. Important don'ts for knitters. Another prized item to be received by the troops were these shooting gloves and mittens. It of course makes sense that the thumb and the fingers would be left exposed in order to operate their guns, but added a little complexity to the knitting. The balaclava, which was also called, that's the European name for it, was also referred to as a helmet. Some of the American knitting patterns referred to it as a cap or a sleeping cap. It was very useful to be able to put that on at night, again, to help filter out some of the cold and dampness for those who were sleeping outside in the frigid, damp air. Notice that in both of these patterns, the cap itself extends down over the neck to help protect the chest and upper back of the wearer. I had a friend, when I was telling her about making or doing this program, she had balaclava, and a friend had given it to her, and so she gave it to me to use for this particular program. She said her teenage sons were not about to wear something like this, particularly in this bright red color. We know at Columbus, Ohio State, red is acceptable. It certainly wouldn't have been in World War I, but it gives you an idea of what this looks like. Also, this one probably is not really long enough to provide the upper chest protection that they would have wanted during the Great War. Knitted scarves had very specific instructions that they were to be 58 inches long, 10 inches wide, again, so they could be wrapped around the chest down to the waist, providing maximum warmth in that area. It was very clear that knitters were meant to feel like they were warriors in this Great War effort in Europe. And here's a poem that actually does a nice job of equating being a knitter with being a warrior. Do you belong to the Wool Brigade? If not, then come along. Mothers, wives, and maidens make this army strong. Gray wool is our ammunition. Some make it into balls. Pass them to the knitting squad. They'll soon use them all. This is no time to be idle and sit with folded hands. So pick up knitting whenever you're sitting. A sock soon grows from your hands. Hark, I hear the bugle call. Somebody wants another ball. All of the words there echoing the warrior effort that was perceived by knitters. Well, the International Red Cross was an important part of this effort to provide knitted comforts to the troops. Of course, this was not just in Britain. Again, all throughout the empire, women and men were knitting and sending those comforts to the Red Cross, who then packaged them and shipped them to their destinations. Here are two posters from the American Red Cross. You will note this one in 1915. Now, the United States didn't enter the Great War that early, but the American women, U.S. women, as well, of course, as Canadians as part of the empire, were working to support the effort of the Allies and knitting whatever they could to be a part of that great knitting effort. I did not know that postcards that featured knitting were sent back and forth as greetings to one another, and women who knitted items would even tuck them in if they were sending an item to their loved one. These very simple postcards, and many of them featured knitting. Some of them were humorous, others were not, but this is a postcard that shows women knitting, and it says, "Each stitch a smile, each loop a prayer, making love's armor for brave lads to wear." Britain suffered a great wool shortage during the period of World War I. Their yarn was of inferior quality compared to other areas in the empire and to the United States. So knitters were excited when they had an opportunity to receive wool from one of these other providers, country providers. But there were shipping and delivery challenges. When you think about getting wool yarn from Australia or New Zealand, the great distance during the war years, it wasn't that they had speedy ways of getting it to Britain, and the ships, once they arrived to the ports were often crowded with warships, and they had to wait. So it was a challenge, but Patton's was one of the better known yarn providers in London, and so they provided advertisement. Every woman can help. It's very fine print up here. It says, night and day, the boys require the ministry of women, and every woman, whatever her calling, can help. They require the ministry of women. Again, that using terms that indicate the sacredness of what knitting provided to the troops. Here's an ad for Betsy Ross yarn from New York City. Uncle Sam with Betsy, and saying, Uncle Sam wants you to knit to protect his boys over there. All of you who are listening may know that during World War I, the British troops were called Tommies. That had become popular during the Boer War between 1899 and 1902, but the U.S. troops were called Sammies, representing Uncle Sam's participation as a favored character hero in the United States. Again, pictures were used throughout the magazines that were being published at the time, in newsprint, anything that would encourage knitting. Women were encouraged to carry their knitting with them wherever they went, and had bags quickly available right around their arm. I say that the woman on the right in the 1918 photo, that's my goal, is to be able to walk around Lakeside at my usual fast clip and knit at the same time. But it wasn't just women who were encouraged to knit. Men were expected to knit too. Certainly convalescent men, both in Europe and in the United States. Here's a group of, it's a poor quality photo, it came out of a newspaper, but stenographers who had a knitting noon hour session while they were employed. The Cincinnati Fire Department, sitting there knitting with a woman helping these older men with the task. And popular, well-known women in the arts. Phyllis Dare was a well-known actress in Britain, and so she helped the effort by having her photo taken with her knitting. I love this picture, 1918, George Hill was 104 years old, and he knitted this pair of socks for Woodrow Wilson. And you see he's knitted in Woodrow, 1918, USA, the Red Cross on the right, and the American flag that shows over here on the left. He was from Dayton, Ohio. And children. There were books specifically for children, and children learned at a very young age to knit. This is a photo of the British Red Cross. You see the girls are all very earnest in their knitting there. 1915, New York Henry Street settlement. They had classes to teach children how to knit. Seattle Elementary School, 1918. These girls are knitting socks. I think of socks as being a challenge to learn to knit. And these girls look to me like they may be 6th or 7th graders and knitting away on their socks. And then, as opposed to that elderly woman, there was particular art that focused on showing that knitters weren't just, women who had nothing else to do in life, but they could be very glamorous individuals. William Barball was a well-known illustrator who focused on drawing particularly charming, beautiful women. And his illustration on the left is called Love Lass. And the heart starts in the bottom, kind of just beyond the point of the heart is a ball of yarn and wraps up around the charming woman who's knitting there. And on the left side is another postcard, absent yet near. I wish I were near to tell you how deep in my thoughts you dwell. But though we're parted today, dear, this card will my kind greetings tell. The artist who illustrated the Red Cross attractive woman sitting at a bedside was Gabrielle Nicolette. Another attractive woman shown in a postcard on the right, knitting either a sock or a mitten. I think it's probably a mitten or a glove given the short gauntlet or wristlet. And then occasionally they used humor. Now the word plain is the term that the Europeans used for what we call a knit stitch. We call them knit stitches and purl stitches, but they called them plains. So here it's a stockinette kind of pattern, 2 plain, 1 purl. And you see the illustrations of the women sitting there knitting this, cartoon by Stan Terry in 1917. Well, I particularly enjoyed researching the sheet music and the illustrations used. I'll share words for some of them. Some of them it's not easy to find the words, so I didn't continue trying to look. But the whole title of this particular piece is I'm over here, you're over there. We'll do our share while you're over there, and shows a grandmotherly figure with the single star flag hanging in her window, representing that she had one son or one loved one serving in the war. This was a song. It was simply called the 1915 Knitting Song by Jessie Pope. She was a very well-known British poetess during this period of time. She wrote a large number of poems about the war, and she dedicated this one to the fireside forces. It has 3 verses, and I'm going to share all of them. There were critiques of her work after the war, saying she was overly sentimental, overly maudlin in her poetry, but I personally like how she has phrased the verses to this particular song. Soldier lad on the sodden ground, sailor lad on the seas, can't you hear a little clickety sound stealing across the breeze? It's the knitting needles singing their song as they twine the khaki or blue. Thousands and thousands and thousands strong, Tommy and Jack for you. The busy hands may be rough or white, the fingers gouty or slim. The careful eyes may be youthfully bright, or they may be weary and dim. Lady and work girl, young and old, they've all got one end in view. Knitting warm comforts against the cold, Tommy and Jack for you. Knitting away by the midnight oil, knitting when day begins. Lads, in the stress of your splendid toil, can't you hear the song of the pins? Clickety-click, through the wind and the foam, it's telling the boys over there that every woolly that comes from home brings a smile, a hope, and a prayer. Okay, several pages of sheet music here. And again, look carefully at the illustrations on the cover. At the top, the word knitting is spelled out using knitting needles. Underneath it says, the war has brought a custom back. This war has brought a custom back that seems to be most fitting. It was the vogue in Grandma's time. It is the art of knitting. This knitting game was something new to nearly every girl. She had to learn to cast a stitch, to make a seam and purl. Each stitch is a thought of you, dear. Again, a grandmotherly figure with 4 stars in her flag, representing her 4 sons or brothers. By the lamplight's glow in the evening, since a mother old and gray, silently knitting with fingers worn for her boys so far away. Though her heart is heavy with sorrow and her brow all wrinkled with care, with every stitch this is fashioned, she breathes a gentle prayer. I'll just comment here. I did find it interesting that a couple of these use very grandmotherly figures on the sheet music, because not all of them who had sons in the war would have been this grandmotherly. When my father was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, he was a 21-year-old captain, but his mother had 2 daughters at home who were 8 and 5. So she wouldn't have looked nearly as old as this woman, although his grandmother would have. Again, a grandmother and her granddaughter sitting. She's knitting a prayer with every purl, called Knitting a Rosary. This song, again, simply called the Knitting Song, was dedicated to the Red Cross. Young and old alike are knitting with tender thought and care for the soldier boys across the sea who bravely do and dare. And all the time we're sitting, we just keep our fingers knitting, while within each heart is breathed a silent prayer. Similar concept to prayer shawls that many churches have groups that knit today, knitting prayers into the project as your approach to providing support and comfort to the one who will receive it. Again, 2 interesting covers. This one, while you're over there in no man's land, I'm over here in lonesome land. In the background, you see soldiers pulling cannons and bombed out buildings in the back. And on the right side, again, yarn unraveled around the edges of the photo. These 2 pieces of sheet music represent from a men's perspective. I may stay away a little longer, writes the soldier in his tent on the lower left, while his beautiful young friend is knitting on the top, thinking that if he stays away a little longer, warm comforts will come from her. No man would have thought that, but it's the idea of the song. And then on the right is an American soldier sitting pondering, I wonder who's knitting for me. All of the women who, unbeknownst to him personally, were sharing that. And interestingly enough, knitting even made it to a stage play. This was an American play written by Helen Sherman Griffith, just a short little play in 1918, and it was focused on a women's group of knitters who had enormous bags, came out on stage, and they grumbled about the monotony of using khaki wool. And Eleanor, one of the women in the group, suggests that maybe why not a cheerful pink or blue instead of that dreadful bilious snow color, because they're underneath wraps anyway. Now, knitting in World War II, women didn't have many years to put down their knitting needles before they took them up again. A new generation of younger women learned from their mothers, their aunts, as well as from the new knitting manuals that became available. But the same types of garments were wanted. Again, the illustrations on the cover of knitting manuals. The balaclava was still very similar. 1940, I love this poster on the right. It's a taxi driver who, when he's not busy driving, is knitting out his window. That look in his face. It's a French poster that says, this little girl, I have learned to knit. I join in solidarity or in the joint effort. 1940s, knitting under the hairdryer in the beauty salon. Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were featured knitting as a motivation for others. This photo is interesting to me. It's a group of women who are knitting. It's obviously some club meeting, but the heat in that building is turned down so low to, preserve the coal or whatever fuel was being used, that they're sitting there with their hats and their long winter coats and knitting away. The photo on the left is taken in a bomb shelter. You can see the arch of the shelter rising above. This is a group of young mothers, must be near a maternity hospital or some condensed housing, because that's a row of babies on the top above where they're sitting, wrapped up in their blankets. But we're not wasting our time sitting in this bomb shelter. We're learning how to knit. Boys learning in class. Look at those studious looks of making sure they're getting all of their stitches just right. Just like Princess Margaret and Elizabeth in Britain, Eleanor Roosevelt had photos taken showing her knitting to encourage U.S. women. The idea was that there were no idle hands. If you were not doing something else, you were expected to have your knitting by your side. A gas station attendant, French women who were serving in transport duty, downtime sitting there knitting. November 1941, Life, the cover illustration was of a woman knitting, and inside were directions on how to knit. That's how important Life viewed it to feature it in their November cover issue, 1941. I thought this was an interesting poster. Remember Pearl Harbor, Pearl Harder. Again, it was a family endeavor. And famous women, women from the screen and stage in the United States, kept their knitting close to them when they had downtime on the movie set. And this was a newspaper feature in a box. Again, I've reprinted it in my typing because it was illegible, trying to just enlarge it. And this is exactly how it appeared. Knitters get busy. War chest wants socks. Appeal is for 150,000 pairs. And it uses the acrostic style of poetry with the word knitters down the left side. K is for knitters, we each must be one. N is for needles, whose work has begun. I is for interest, which makes us take part. T are the troops, so dear to each heart. T are the trench feet, we won't let them feel. E is the effort, for war chest appeal. R is the rhyme we must write to each boy. S are the socks which bring him such joy. World War II sheet music, some new songs, new illustrations. Kitty was a girl from Kansas City. This one is called Pick Up Your Knitting, with a large naval ship there over her left shoulder. Pick up your knitting, there's a job to do. British boys would love a pair of socks from you. In the subway or the bus, take your needles, do not fuss. Your helmets and your mittens will cheer and thrill the Britons. So girls, come on, get a hank of Yankee yarn and knit a bundle of socks for Britain. Knit one, purl two. This was actually a Glenn Miller song that he wrote. And this one, tend to your knitting. Knitting. And this really sums up, to me, the message of knitting for the troops from both the Great War. This, of course, is a World War II poster, but knit for victory. Women, you have a job to do. Certainly in World War II, women went to work in factories, in doing jobs that were important as part of the militaristic war effort, but the knitting was still valuable. And if you could knit before you went to work in the morning, you could knit before you went to bed at night, but you could be a part of an effort to support the troops. I wanted to tell you about the two reference books that I particularly found valuable. Lots of articles, lots of websites, but these two books both provided, if you want to read more, the older one on the left, No Idle Hands, A Social History of American Knitting, published in 1988 by Anne MacDonald, and the one on the right is a more recent one called Knitting for Tommy, Keeping the Great War Soldier Warm by Lucinda Gosling, a 2014 publication. This one I actually borrowed from the Delaware Public Library, and I'll be returning it this afternoon. Well, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to have questions or comments from my audience here. It's always nice, even when you're doing a presentation that's being videotaped, to have an audience. I enjoyed having the nodding, the feedback from your eyes, even though I couldn't see whether you were smiling or frowning under your mask. But any questions from any of you, given that you were all knitters?
You touched on it a bit, but I would think that acquiring the yarn was a bit of a challenge for the women.
It was a challenge. Now, the Red Cross provided kits, and according to one reference I read, they were called Granny's kits. At least in one part of this was in Britain, they were 75 cents, and that was to ensure that people wouldn't come and just keep the knitting or the yarn for themselves. You would knit and turn it back in, and then you would get either the 75 cents back, or usually you would just take another kit. But they were called granny kits because elderly women who would do a lot of knitting didn't have the financial resources in Britain. You know, they didn't have Social Security and funds that would enable them to buy something that was beyond their immediate needs. So the Red Cross, that was one of the efforts that they did, is to have kits available and people could come and get the yarn to do a particular project and then return it. But yarn was a big issue, and as I said, the quality of the yarn in Britain itself was not very good compared to what they could get from international sources.
Do
you know the logistics of how they were collected and shipped to?
There were particular sites that people would turn their yarn into, widely distributed through the community. And then if it was a Red Cross site, obviously the Red Cross volunteer workers would package it up. But I saw a couple of photos that were women's club areas. So they could be brought to a specific women's club, and women would pack it up in boxes and then mail them to a designation spot before they were shipped, if they were from the United States, before they were shipped to Europe. If you were doing other than for your own particular relatives. But that's how that was managed. And it was something that well-to-do women would do. You know, it was a time that they could gather with their friends, but again, they were doing something for the war effort with each other in their fur coats and their beautiful hats. I saw one photo illustrating that.
I was just going to applaud you for the collection of photographs and the
Sheet music.
the pictures, the newspaper clippings. Do you have a small collection of some of this yourself?
I personally don't. I relied on other sources who do have collections and who've put them together either in book format or on the website. There are, of course, people who collect music, sheet music from different eras with a different focus, and so it was fun to look at those websites. There's one website each for World War I and World War II music, but they're by the same collector.
I'm in awe of all of this, and being a knitter, I've heard of this, but the degree to which these women stitched away. You know,
Yes, and the children. I don't know that in the U.S. today we have the solidarity of sentiment to have an effort like this that is so widely distributed among the community that teachers in a classroom would set aside time every day for their whole class to knit. We have, these curriculum prescriptions that certainly would discourage that kind of activity, and that kids in general, boys particularly, would see that as, this is my contribution. I saw an interesting, this was just last evening, an interesting report of a publication, I don't remember the source. It could have been a knitting magazine, a knitting manual. All of these companies that sold yarn, that sold pamphlets, that sold knitting bags, didn't just advertise their product. They were part of the marketing of this global effort, this countrywide effort. And they had a list of, they had published 50 things for children to do to support the war effort. The number one item on the list was, do some of your mother's chores so she can knit. And then there was one further down the line that was, wash the dishes so your mother can knit. Do your homework without your mother's help so she can knit. I mean, all of these things specifically telling children, your effort needs to be devoted to your household support of your mother so she can knit. Don't be taking her time frivolously. Other questions or comments? Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here today. If there are questions from any of you viewers at a later time, you may contact the Powell Historical Society, and they will forward the question to me, and I will respond via email to you. Thank you so much, and let's all remember the veterans of this country on November the 11th.
Thank you.